Our Center for Historical Research series on revolutions for 2017 through 2018. Today, Professor Vasileios Syros will be joining us to talk about the reason of state tradition and early modern political discourse on revolution. Professor Syros is a senior research fellow at the Academy of Finland, more specifically the Finnish Center for Political Thought and Conceptual Change, which I thought was a great title. Currently, he's a fellow at the Italian Academy for Advanced Studies in America at Columbia University. He has been a fellow at University of Pennsylvania, University of Chicago, and numerous other distinguished institutions of higher education, Stanford. And through all this, he's really been a connector for people who are interested in studying comparative religion. He's involved in a 4-year program about study of revolution. He's been involved with planning conferences and really bringing together a global cast of scholars who are exploring these issues from Aristotle to the Arab Spring. He's the author of Well Begun is Only Half Done, Tracing Aristotle's Political Ideas in Medieval Arabic, Syriac, Byzantine, and Jewish Sources, and Vasileios of Padua at the Intersection of Ancient and Medieval Cultures, as well as numerous articles in the Journal of Early Modern History, the Journal of World History, and the History of Political Thought. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Syros, and we'll hear what he says about the reason of state tradition.
Yeah. It's a great honor to be here. Margaret, thank you very much for your invitation. And I was very happy to learn about your project on revolutions. And actually, I was thinking of applying to the Center for Historical Research a couple of years ago, and it didn't work. But and we changed the number of emails with John and Greg. But I'm finally happy to be here at Ohio State University, and hopefully there will be overlap and future collaboration when it comes to statehood and revolutions. So the topic of my talk is the reason of state tradition in early modern Europe and pre-modern concepts and notions of revolution. We talk about Machiavelli as one of the major figures in the history of revolutions or thinking about revolutions. And there's a lacuna when it comes to literature that engages with Machiavelli and tries to reconcile Machiavelli's political theory with the principles and doctrines of the Christian religion. And 16th century Europe witnessed the flourishing of a very important genre of writings about Machiavelli and how to reconcile and harmonize his political theory with Christian doctrines. This tradition culminated and is crystallized in what we call reason of state, ragion di Stato, a major strand of political writing in Italy that is exemplified by a major ex-Jesuit writer, Giovanni Botero. Giovanni Botero wrote 2 major works which engage with Machiavelli and set the tenor for later subsequent writing on reason of state. One is his work on Magnificent Cities, a work that involves a description of various cities and polities around the world, an elaborate description of the factors involved in political greatness and magnificence. And the other work is about the reason of state. In these works, Botero is concerned with the conservation of political structures. And a major difference between Machiavelli and the reason of state scholars, theorists, is that Machiavelli is concerned with founding a state, preserving a state, and he's very much attached to the Roman example, paradigm. The reason of state tradition, on the other hand, is primarily interested in the conservation, the preservation of state structures, of a state, or of a specific polity. And the third work by Botero has been neglected, but is equally important in my sense, is a work that is entitled Universal Relations. So this work major comprehensive work about different societies, states, politics around the world, deals with the cultures, political organization, economic organization of a number of states around the world, including China, European states, African states, Mozambique, etc. So this is a very important work because it's the application of the theoretical principles crystallized into two major works of Botero to the study and exploration, the comparative investigation of diverse political systems around the world. In a sense, this is a work that predates and prefigures what we call today comparative politics or comparative government. And a major theme that permeates this literature about the regional state is political change. So we have here a number of writings dealing with Machiavelli, dealing with the ethical principles and underpinnings of politics and government, but we also have enshrined in these writings a comprehensive theory about political change and ways to avert change in light of different circumstances, conditions, and political cultural norms prevailing in different societies. So we're, in our narratives about revolutions and about the pre-modern concept of revolutions, we're inclined to gloss over this particular kind of writing that is so important and so foundational in our thinking, in modern thinking about the state, about statehood. And Botero, in a sense, is one of the very few writers who writes in the 16th century, and he advocates, as I discussed earlier in Margaret's class, the distinction between the state or the body politic and the sovereign, the ruler. This is a major development here because in Machiavelli and earlier scholarship about mirrors of princes, manuals for rulers, etc., the main focus is the prince, is the ruler, and everything is concerned with the specific qualifications, attributes, and virtues of the ruler, the prince. The main protagonist in these writings is the prince. And that's why Machiavelli is one of the major figures in the evolution of mirrors of princes. Books written for rulers, like mirrors. Mirrors which a ruler can use to prepare himself and see where he stands and how he can improve his style of government. For Botero, although he retains certain features of this mirror of princes genre, the main object is the state, political structures. That's why his work is entitled The Magnificence and Greatness of Cities, because the main concern here is not the greatness of a specific ruler, but the greatness, the strength, and the longevity of a state. And by default, this shift of attention from the persona of the ruler to the higher body politic or state entails important ramifications for the way regional state scholars envision revolution or political change. Another important theorist who writes in this tradition and engages with Machiavelli is Traiano Boccalini. Boccalini is very important because he operates in the distinction between what is good and healthy regional state and what is the excessive use of regional state and the distortion of this concept. And there's a very interesting passage in his work, Ragguari di Parnaso, which is advertisements about Parnassus in English, where there is a debate with different rulers. And at some point, Boccalini mentions the Ottoman Empire and mentions that the Ottoman sultans were so rigorous and so excessive, so zealous in their application of justice that they generate resentment. In that sense, although they're trying to preserve the state and they're trying to apply norms and rules intended to safeguard their power, their excessive rigor creates resentment, alienates people, alienates their ministers, and that can lead to potential political change and revolution. And the third figure, who is also very, very important in this kind of writing about revolutions, is a rather neglected figure in Turin, 1629. Ottavio Sammarco wrote a book about the changes in Italian regime, changes in different kinds of rule and regimes. So with Sammarco, we have here the recovery and reapplication of ancient learning about revolutions in a more systematic manner and fashion about political change. And in this work, what the author is trying to achieve is a comprehensive list of insights into the causes, origins, and effects of political constitutional changes. This work was translated in the 8th century in English, and there's the title is about the revolutions of in kingdoms. And this is a very misleading translation because the author talks about changes in regime, in different kinds of forms of rule and regime types. And I believe that with Sammarco we have here the culmination of a genre of writing about revolutions in the pre-modern period that is expressed and manifested in what we would call political social change. This relates to the question about, is there a pre-modern concept of revolution, and to what extent does the original state tradition enunciate or prefigures, adumbrates a modern notion of revolution? And I think that these authors, at least in the Italian context, are deeply embedded in the classical tradition and the idea of constitutional change as a variant or a precursor of what we call revolution today. But we don't have a full-fledged concept of revolution the way we have it with Tocqueville or other thinkers in the French context, for example. So the key feature of these writings is, first of all, the conservation of the state, the conservation of a comprehensive, of a self-sufficient polity within a specific territory that has its own defense mechanisms, its own army, its own political structures, its own religion, but also material self-sufficiency. That's why Butero, in his work, is against the Roman example. And in the Relazioni Universali, there's a very interesting section, chapter, about China. And although he's critical of the Chinese, he thinks it's an arbitrary regime, he's despotic, he's very different from Western regimes, he writes somewhere that the Chinese were prudent and wise enough to realize that expansion is not the best way to preserve a state. So at some point in their history, they tried to engage in military expeditions, they failed, they lost people, and they retreated. And then, since then, they didn't attempt any other military expeditions and campaigns. And he writes that any person who is wise enough would understand that warfare and military expansion is against the conservation of the state. So we have here a very interesting debate about China as a self-sufficient mercantilist utopia that is very different from other accounts about China in the West. And the main dimension here, the main aspect of this conversation about China is not the specific form of rule that prevails there, but self-sufficiency, serenity, and the ability of a specific regime to retain its power and vigor. And in this sense, Butero prefigures the debate about the relationship, the interface of efficiency, political efficiency, and the form of rule that prevails in a specific society or polity. conservation is, in this sense, intimately linked to the whole debate about how the ruler or a government can use and allocate resources to sustain the state. And a portion of Voltaire's work is dedicated to discussing how the state of the ruler should use resources to support the poor, for example, because the increase in the number of vulnerable members in society is a major cause of friction, civil strife, and political change. Another very important aspect in this, in the whole debate about political change in this tradition is the distinction between what we call the sovereign, the ruler, and the state or the body politic. And as we discussed earlier this morning, in Machiavelli and Mirrors of Princes in the medieval period, for example, we have the ruler is typically associated with the state. Everything revolves around the ruler, and he's a dynamic center of the entire body politic. That's why in medieval political discourse, the ruler is associated with either the brain or the heart of the body politic. And as such, the ruler forms an integral part of the entire political organism. In other writings produced in the Italian context in the 16th and 17th centuries, the ruler is extricated from the body politic. And we see here the application of a new medical model about the body politic that is premised on the idea that the body has 4 major humors. This hints at Galen's natural medical model of the 4 humors that envisions the collaboration, synergies among the 4 humors as one of the major conditions for the existence of the functional, well-ordered state. In this sense, all 4 humors are equally important and indispensable, but the ruler is distinct from the body politic. In a way, Foucault has talked about the origin of state tradition as one of the major aberrations of what we call governmentality. And in his project about governmentality and how it emerged in early modern Europe, the origin of state tradition incubated all these ideas about the body politic, about sexuality, for example, and also about the relationship, the very complex and intricate relationship between the ruler and the various parts of the body politic. So the very fact that the ruler in this kind of writings is distinct from the body politic has very important implications in terms of how these thinkers envision revolution or political change. And the major, one of the major thesis underpinning this theory, this vision of the state and society, is that the ruler is the agency that can hold things together, that can harness the strengths and abilities of the different parts of society, but at the same time he needs to incorporate and embody technical knowledge, the know-how to perform his function. So in this sense, even if the ruler is gone, the body politic will exist, will persist, and will operate according to its own rules and norms. This is, in a sense, a very important thesis that leads to, that hints at the process of depersonalization of power, or diffusion of power, that occurs in the 16th century in Europe, specifically in France, but also in Italy. And we see here that the emergence of a very strong modern state, by default, necessitates diffusion of power, delegation of authority, and the existence of different agencies and organs within the government. One of the first thinkers to elucidate the structure of what we call the modern state was the legal scholar, thinker Jean Boudin, a contemporary of Machiavelli and Boudin, who in his 6 books of the Republic, he provides, I believe, one of the first elaborate accounts of what we call the modern state, modern statehood. And there, in that book, we have a very detailed description, a narrative about the different organs, the different instances, the different groups comprising a state, and at the same time we have one of the first statements about how diffusion of power, how delegation of authority constitutes one of the premises, one of the major factors contributing to the modern state. This process of delegation of authority and diffusion of power is an important turning point in this period that I believe is crystallized in the original state tradition. So the conservation of the state and the endeavor to avert political change or revolution, according to the modern concept of the word, necessitates the harmony and collaboration among all these different groups comprising the state, the human societies, and highlights the role of the ruler, of the sovereign, as a guarantor of peace, tranquility, and unity. In this sense, there is a pre-modern concept of revolution that, in a sense, prefigures what we call this revolution today, in a sense of economic change, economic dramatic relocation of authority, but also it remains deeply embedded in the classical concept, in the classical notion of revolution or political change as initiated by Aristotle and the Greek classics. Machiavelli is a major a major figure in the evolution of this concept, because Machiavelli, in a way, filters this, distills this concept, and subsequent writings about the concept of revolution engage with his thinking. But I think the original state tradition and the whole debate about conservation initiates a new phase in the evolution of the concept that is very modern and distinctly Italian, in the sense that it retains the fluidity and the different aspects of revolution that occurred in medieval and early modern Italy. Thank you.
I'll let Professor Syros take questions.
Yeah, thank you for a very provocative presentation. About halfway through, you started talking about the Chinese. You said that the Chinese state, if this is the 17th century, this must be the late Ming.
Ming.
Yeah. The Chinese state came under criticism for many things, but was praised for self-sufficiency. And I'm sure the Chinese would have loved to have heard this themselves. But why discuss China at all? Surely there must have been other better examples closer to home.
You mean Butera in general?
With regard to this issue of self-sufficiency.
Right. The big elephant in the room are the Ottomans. The Ottomans are the major power, and these thinkers always engage with the Ottomans as a major rival and major threat to the Italian city-states. China is a very important point of reference because, first of all, China is far, right? So China is not an immediate rival or enemy, but also because China lends itself to utopian thinking. So we have in the 16th century Thomas More, who writes the Utopia, right? But another way to articulate utopian thinking and to provide a template, a model for utopian writing is China. Because China is a big country. We have Marco Polo, who wrote about China, and all these thinkers, in a sense, engage with Marco Polo, right? Although lots of the stuff is inaccurate, is anachronistic, right?
Actually, that's part of my question.
Right.
Whether their image of China is influenced by the man that I understand that the Italians to have called Il Milione, the man of 1,000 lives.
Right. I mean, their vision of China is colored by Marco Polo. And we find Botero traces that he used Marco Polo, and certain things are just wrong or anachronistic. But Botero himself was in a privileged position to elicit information about China through his contacts with links to the Jesuits. Because he served, different positions. He was part of the order. So he never went to China himself, but he was in a very privileged position. He was well placed to receive information about China from reports produced by Jesuits, by missionaries, by diplomats, by investors, or merchants. Right? And in the Relazione Universali, among all the other states of the world, the Mongols, the Ottomans, the European states, China stands out as a utopia. So he depicts China as a hierarchic, as a peaceful, stable society that refrains from war. And in my sense, the engagement of the Jesuits with the Roman example, which is so important and central in Machiavelli, right, culminates, it's crystallized in this account about China. Of course, he doesn't praise the regime of the Chinese, there are limitations, they can travel, we know all this stuff. But the major argument underpinning this narrative is that China refrains from war. So they stay within their borders, right? They're wise enough, they have the material resources, and they engage in trade. And for Botero, it seems that despite the size of the country, this is a viable model. Because Botero himself is averse to the idea of having a big, large state. He advocates a medium-sized state like Korea today, which is self-sufficient, which can engage in trade transactions, but not a big state. So my reading is that Botero rehabilitates or justifies the Chinese that in this specific work, he articulates another version of utopia based on his exposure to these reports about China. So you have reason of state, which is a very pragmatic approach to politics, which envisions the state as an entity with its own rules, norms, and mechanisms. That's called reason of state, right? But at the same time, you have the beginnings of utopian thinking in the Jesuit tradition that culminates in the 7th century.
I have a question. So, you have like Botero's work, kind of like it's an early comparative politics. How does that like compare and contrast with comparative politics as we know it today?
Oh, it's like
Just like in like mainstream like political science departments in university.
I mean, there are two portions of Botero's work. In my sense, there's a theoretical part, which is about the reason of state, which is about Machiavelli, which is about the greatness of cities, right? And that's the theoretical segment of his thinking. And we have the universal relations, which is a very different kind of work. And as I said earlier, the universal relations is a work that incorporates information about different states around the world according to specific metrics. And I believe that this work, along with some other works produced in 16th, 17th century France, are the first systematic efforts to generate comparative politics. Right? They're descriptive, they have certain metrics, they apply those metrics, they analyze different policies according to this criteria. The other part, the more theoretical part, is a manual about good government, right? And today we don't have manuals, we don't have mirrors and princes, right? But we do have journalists who write about government, right? We have articles, we have op-eds, we have all kinds of books and and dissertations that deal with good government, right? The difference is that the relations, the universal relations, mirrors a much more relativistic approach to politics, because it takes into consideration different polities, different states, and different conditions prevailing in different parts of the world. The first part is much more, the former part is much more normative, right? It has a more universal dimension that's applicable to different forms of rule and regimes. Thank you.
Vasileios, thank you very much. That was very, very enlightening. And as far as I can tell, your story here is essentially an episode that has not been given enough attention in the story, let's call it the genealogy of the modern state as an entity. And so the beginning of the story would be a medieval corpus mysticum with the ruler as the head, as it were, or the heart, and the people as the body. So we have a unitary entity, and then the end of the story is the modern state, which is, you know, this wholly autonomous machine-like entity that dominates from outside the population of subjects that it rules. So it's like, how do we get from A to B? And you're trying to pin down a particular moment in this story where we start to see the beginnings of a clear separation, as it were, between ruler and ruled, such in a theoretical sense. So, and I'm just wondering how this moment that you're trying to pin down, how this would qualify the famous Quentin Skinner approach, because he obviously focuses a lot on Machiavelli, and he uses the term state to describe what Machiavelli is talking about as this newly discovered object of theoretical interest, let's say. And yet, I think he would concede that at this point, the state is still not really fully separated from the polity as a whole, let's call it that. That it's still seen as, you know, it is the prince's domain, as if he is the sort of the head of the family. And I think Foucault talks about it in these kind of terms as well. So are you suggesting something that we've gone to the next stage, as it were, in the separation, the kind of post-Machiavelli phase? Because once we start talking about raison d'etat, but I mean, it still seems like the very title of Botero's work is I assume the word città is in there. And so we're talking about still a unitary entity of a city rather than a more modern style, here's our state and here's our society. So I'm just asking you maybe just to try to pin down maybe a bit more specifically where we are in the story with your piece here.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Rick. Foucault talks about the division of practical science into three major forms. One is the individual conduct, right? Individual virtues. The second is the management of the household, the family. And the third is the administration of the community, right? Of the city, of the state. And this division, which again emanates from the Greeks, we have Bryson, we have late antique thinkers who write about the family, Xenophon, for example, and how the family prefigures the state, right? And how the ruler, the sovereign, has to embody all of these qualifications and virtues in ruling the state of the public sphere. It's very important, and it survives with the Lavoisier, for example, in France, and he writes a manual for the King of France with three major divisions and portions in this book. The problem here is that we don't have a totally modern or full-fledged version of the state or statehood, right? Right. But I do believe that we have a gradual shift from the persona of the prince, of the sovereign, to institutions, what we call the city. The city as an ensemble.
So to put it crudely, it's like the separation of the man from the office, as it were, as strong as...
No, it's not the man in the office, it's the man in the city.
Okay.
Because the city is an assortment of institutions, right? Of norms, of political principles that is becoming distinct from the prince. And I think Skinner, with all due respect, hasn't taken into account this very important chapter, episode in the history of thinking about statehood, about the state, that was so important, so influential throughout Europe. So we know that Baudin writes about the state. Baudin provides this very important book about the republic, which is not a republic, actually it's a kingdom, right? But the original state tradition, in a sense, supplements this kind of debates about the state, about statehood in the Italian context. Now, why is Italy so different, so important? I believe there's a certain degree of fluidity in this whole narrative that is reflected in Butero. And as you said, Città is of course a city. We have city-states, city republics, but at the same time, Città is a generic designation for different kinds of powers. Of course, China would never be a Città, right? It would be a big Città. But it's more about institutions. It's an assortment of institutions, an ensemble of institutions that is distinct from the prince, from the ruler. But I think the crucial difference here, and this is something that I think people don't get, is that there's no contract. So in England, we have the social contract tradition, right? This is very important. You have a ruler, a sovereign, you have the state or the body politic, and there's a contract. But here, you don't have you have no references to a contract in the way Hobbes does, or law. So it's hard to conceptualize how the ruler operates and how the ruler relates to the body politic without having an explicit contract.
Is that partly because in the Italian tradition, there's no sense of the possibility of a community, a civitas or città, subsisting, as it were, anarchically, and then only later on deciding they need rulers, where in the Italian tradition it's just taken for granted there are always going to be rulers because we always need them, or some way of ruling, whereas in the, as you point out, the Anglophone tradition there is this idea, however far-fetched, that there once was a time before any rulers at all, and so in other words, what we later go on to call society pre-exists, is sort of ontologically prior to any ruling entity.
I think the Italians take for granted that there is a ruler, that there is a sovereign, and by default, there will be a ruler in this whole setting, right? There might be a different ruler who might come from outside the city, and that was the case with the medieval potestat, right? You had legal scholars who would go to another city and would serve as the head of the city for a certain period of time, and then would leave. That was the potestat system, right? And this person was there to harmonize the different parts of the city and avert conflict. That's why he was a person from outside. He was never from the city itself. In England, we have, in the Anglophone tradition, there's the assumption that there is a sort of a mythical phase, people come together, there's a state of nature, and at some point we need to sign a contract, right? And give up our rights and create a sovereign. But I think it's a very different conception of what we have in Italy. That's why I think Italy, in a sense, is a laboratory for political thinking in this period. And it lends itself to all kinds of interpretations about politics, about comparative politics, about government, or about revolution that is very different from France, Spain, and England. Yes, sir.
I wonder if you could clarify the revolution dimension. It's implicit, it seems to me, implicit in the role of these things in working out the continuity of state, because a revolution is a discontinuity. But I just wonder how do we spell out that Italian understanding of revolution? I haven't quite got enough to play with here.
So revolution in this period becomes very, very, it proliferates with, in scientific lexicon, right? It's an astronomical concept, revolution, right? It's about the convection of stars, it's an astronomical
so the sense of revolving.
Right. Yeah. But in these writings, it's more about political change or minor alterations to the existing form of rule or regime. So you might have a certain form of rule in the city, and you might have minor changes, modifications, right, alterations. Or you might have a more dramatic, more radical change that happens when we have a new ruler coming in, for example, right, like the Medici in
So
Florence.
this gets back to Greg's framework of the man, the prince, being separated from the city or from the institutions, and then you can replace the prince. And the institutions don't change.
Of course, every prince will try to change institutions, right? And every reformer or every new holder of power will try to erode the previous regime or build on the previous regime, right? And to solidify his power. But I think that it's a period where there's a proliferation of ideas about institutions and about the body politic that operates within the parameters of depersonalization of power. So you do have a ruler, of course, you have a sovereign and prince who are rules over the city. But the expansion of the city, the expansion of the apparatus, and the engagement of different groups in decision making generates diffusion of power and delegation of authority. So you don't have a strong ruler controlling the entire state.
But the civil society, then, we'll call it a civil society then.
Possibly,
It changes incrementally.
It changes, it expands, it becomes more, it gets more clarified, and it has certain contours here, certain features that pre-exist in the Middle Age, for example. Of course, there's always civil society, right?
Yeah.
Even in Athens, in classical Greece, it was a civil society, right? But here, I think we have a more concrete form of the civil society that attains certain autonomy.
The forms don't change dramatically and suddenly, right? They're incrementally shifting, and you can see that they are.
Right. But you don't have a constant revolution of violent, revolution like in France, where somebody will take over. Of course, you have movements against the sort of rulers in Florence, for example, right? But it's not the same constant revolution as it is later in France, for example. So I think it's something between the Middle Ages and the modern period, but it still retains certain features of the classical tradition. And I think with some of these writings, we have the revival of Aristotle. Aristotle's theory about political change, Book 5, applied to contemporary realities. So it's still very scholastic, it's still very medieval, but at the same time it points to certain directions that are very familiar to a modern Western observer.
I really enjoyed hearing about the particularities of how these metaphors of the body politic are kind of worked out. And I was wondering if you'd be able to elaborate on the discussion of how the four humors worked, and if there's a discussion of what each of those humors represented in the text that you're working on.
Sure. So we have here three major parts of the body politic. You have the grandee, the nobility. You have the middle class. You have the poor, right, the more weak, more vulnerable parts of society. So all these three parts, or even two parts, that is like the popolo and the grandee, are associated with different humors, right? So for Machiavelli and other writers who operate within the parameters of this model, the success of a ruler is not to eliminate or suppress a specific part of the population, but to ensure that there's collaboration and synergy between these two humors, for example, or three humors. And it's very interesting that for many Italian writers, the model of a successful regime is Venice. Because Venice is a stable society that retained this regime for centuries, right? It didn't experience the same troubles and fleeting as Florence, for example. And Venice is extolled as the paragon of stability because it's a mixed regime, mixed government that incorporates elements from the three main healthy forms of rule: from kingship, from aristocracy, and from democratic element. And Venice has successfully incorporated the royal element, those of the nobility with aristocracy, and the people who are involved in this whole process. Of course, there are different ways to portray Venice, and in this system, some people have more power than others, as always the case. But for many Italians, this concept of the humorous is related to the so-called governo misto, mixed government. I think Popper writes a lot about this, right? About Venice and about the reception of the Venetian government in America, right? Venice was always celebrated as the model of stability.
Well, and that way of thinking goes all the way back to at least Polybius.
Polybius, right.
As it were, between the
Exactly.
Greeks and the Romans.
Or later.
And the Roman system celebrated as
Right.
the ultimate governo misto.
Right, exactly, yeah. Or Sparta.
And you wonder how much that legacy is shaping thought here, that people are wanting to look for examples of this, and that shapes the way they then think about Venice, because they know there's a precedent for it, as it were, and obviously a certain idealization of ancient ways in this Republican universe, and just how, in other words, it's not that if they never read Polybius or never read anything in that ancient tradition, would they have still thought about Venice in the same terms as this ideal mixed republic type place?
And we have the first trace of thinking about Venice as a mixed constitution in the Middle Ages, and people didn't have access to Polybius or Platon's laws. Right? So you do have hints of this structure, I think around the 13th, 14th century. But it really culminates with George of Treviso and all his works about Plato, about mixed constitution. And in a sense, these works provide is the fulcrum for new interpretations of the Venetian government on the base of this mixed constitutional theory. So I think you're right that it's possible that people had the concept of Venice as a stable regime, but the proliferation of writings about mixed constitution, or at least the percolation of this about mixed constitution, contributed to the proliferation of writings about Venice as a mixed regime. And I think the same is with Aristotle, because Aristotle, in a sense, the politics, encapsulates a model about revolutions in Book 5 that provides thinkers in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance with a framework how to think about revolutions. Of course, we don't know about revolutions, right? We don't need to read Aristotle about some revolutions. But having a systematic narrative about revolutions that lays out the different factors and causes involved in revolutions helps people articulate a more comprehensive theory about revolutionary change that you don't have in other traditions, like the Islamic tradition. You don't have the same theory about revolution you have in the West.
So you were suggesting in the discussion this morning, though, that amongst some of the Mughal kingdoms, they used a Galenic medical model of humors as well to describe the estates, and less of a class model in some ways than a occupation function within the state, right? So that seems less uniquely Italian, or at least the notion of these large constitutional elements of society and how to keep them in kind of creative tension, as well as a high state of effectiveness. So I think try to get back to what's unique about the Italian example. Is it more that they're about avoiding revolution? I mean, that it's all that they feel that they're in a fluid moment almost an imperial moment. Like the criticism of China, or excuse me, the elevation of China and the criticism of Rome also seems like it might be related to empire and expansion, right? So that are they in a moment where they're experiencing a lot of dramatic economic change,
Right.
Global contact,
Right.
an effort to manage change. It seems like a lot of these are manuals for avoiding revolution.
Yes.
So you know what I'm saying. Which you talked about this morning too. So so maybe that's what's also uniquely Italian. I mean, certainly a lot of these other regimes are trying to avoid change, maintain stability, keep these humors and create tension. But in our class, people have been very interested in this notion of stability, right? There's a lot of talk about stability and instability, but there's also some of the best studies of revolutions seem to be written by people who are trying to avoid them or trying to figure out what prevents them. So I don't know. I just wondered if that was maybe something that.
I mean, in a sense, every manual for princes in every tradition could be read as a book against revolution, right? Because every manual wants to help the prince exercise stable rule and retain his power. So I don't think there's anything distinctly Italian to writing a manual for princes or mirror princes that you have in China and Islam and India, for example, right? I mean, every manual has its function, right? And although they don't deal with revolution per se, they encapsulate theories about revolution, insights that can be used to avert revolutions, right? What I find very interesting in Italy is that they assign bias to different models about government that are colored and shaped by experiences and exposure to different cities, right? That's one thing that's very important. And I think you have a certain degree of fluidity that all these people try to address, try to mitigate or remedy in a sense. So in a sense, this of course you have religious wars in Europe, you have economic crisis in Spain, you have people writing about the economic crisis in Spain, and the so-called arbitristas, right? They're accountants or economic thinkers who try to write about political economic decline in Spain, right? But the fact that you don't have a strong imperial or royal setting in Italy, I think, and the degree of fluidity that permeates these writings sets Italy apart from other traditions. And at the same time, the entire debate, discourse about revolutions is deeply embedded in the classical tradition. So Rome is there, the Greek tradition is there, and every debate about revolution by default will engage with Rome, because Rome is a big elephant in the room, right? And in a sense, China is projected as a model that is very, very different from Rome.
To what extent does the reason of state theory separate state and rule from divine sanctification? Or does the ruler still receive sanctification from God, and simply the state exists as a separate entity created to preserve rule?
I mean, there are iterations of this theory that lend a specific aura, divine charisma to the ruler. But in these writings, it's more pragmatic, and there's distinction between theology and rulership. So you don't have a kind of ruler that is divinely anointed or sanctioned the way you have it in other periods or other traditions, right? But so there's no narrative here about how the ruler is appointed. And you don't have the mythical thing with the popes, for example, the whole prehistory of how the transition from the state of nature to civil society, and how the sovereign is appointed. And that reflects again the interest of these thinkers in the conservation of a pre-existing state. So it's more about preservation and continuity, permanence, than about exploring, tracing the genealogy of rulership and how a specific person became ruler per se. And I would imagine many of the thinkers would advocate a not perfect ruler ruling over a stable society by having a perfect sovereign that can create, chaos.
First, thank you so much for a really interesting lecture. I have to apologize, I'm far out of my field, so the question may reflect that. But I wanted to follow up on John and Margaret's questions a little bit. I found really fascinating, I think I was understanding you to say that in this period coming from the roots in astronomy, the revolution originally here had a dual definition, right? One being much more radical, the way we think of it more today, and one being about subtle transitions and changes within the state apparatus. And I just wanted to ask you a follow-up on that. Is what's happening here in the reason of state tradition a kind of movement back and forth between those notions of revolution such that the subtle changes over time in this state that is becoming newly independent from the head, the heart ruler, is that seen as preferable to this other notion, this more intense notion, and is that a dialogue that's operating here?
I think there's a conversation here between the two models.
Yeah, that's really
Right?
interesting.
And I don't think they have a definitive answer to the problem.
Right.
There's an ongoing conversation.
Right.
And I think this problem is resolved in the 17th century. But at that time, that point, I think there's an ongoing conversation.
Right.
That's why you find many thinkers, the scientists of both models. You find thinkers like Hobbes,
Right.
use the heart and brain example. At the same time, they use the machine metaphor,
Right.
the status machine, right?
Right.
And the ruler is there as a technician, as an expert, who has technical learning and knowledge
Right.
to regulate the state.
Right.
So these people operate at this transition, and that's why you find this sign bias of both models.
Right. Right.
And it's a very profound, very important conversation.
Right.
But I think they realize that the success of the state and the best way to avert revolution is by creating strong institutions. And that's why the whole debate in Voltaire and other writers is not about the greatness of a specific ruler. It's about the greatness, the magnificence of the state. Of course, that includes the ruler, includes other authorities, includes urban space, which is also very important. Urban space is very important. Buildings, building projects are very important and are a tangible manifestation of greatness. But they're built for the common good, not for the ruler per se, right? And when the ruler is gone, they're still there, right? So it's more about resources and it's more about how the ruler uses resources, allocates resources to support the state. And greatness emanates from the good use of resources. That's why he writes the Chinese realized at some point that making wars wasn't conducive to their stability, and they stopped making wars.
Thank you. That's interesting.
I'm going to throw a obnoxious thing there, but the combination of conversations about the English contract tradition and the discussion of the English assuming that there was a time that it came out of the state of nature, I'm starting to flash on Thomas Erdmann's descriptions in The Birth of Leviathan, where he actually lays it out. England was in a horrific state of nature.
Right.
After the Roman fall, after the Romans left, they fell into hundreds of years of civil war that they gradually emerged from and built up barbarian local institutions that eventually a monarch was inserted on top of. Now, they had local monarchs, but William the Conqueror came along. And deep into the early modern period, the popular language was the Norman yoke. Get rid of the Norman yoke. So effectively, what I'm hearing, what this suggests is that in fact the English tradition of revolution is far more powerful in a certain sense and disruptive of this Italian tradition of conservation, of the maintenance of the state, of the preservation, of the building, the creation of institutions to conserve and create stability. Meanwhile, we have this highly unstable structure, or at least unstable relationship between king and people in this peripheral island that generates a revolutionary spiral that manifests itself in killing the king, transforming the institutions, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, I mean, I think that what I'm interested in is, in fact, this idea that you created this. I now can see an Italian-English continuum, fundamentally different, though I can see the Italian, we can see how the Italian models of the stability of the state inject themselves in the 16th century. Henry VII, Henry VIII are very interested in continental models. They must have read Machiavelli. They are concerned about the maintenance of, just the way the Italians are, the maintenance of the stability of their regime. But lurking under the surface is a mythical history that doesn't bode well for the monarchs in the English tradition. And I don't know how to play this out in France, but and maybe that France didn't have either. France is more Italian, but effectively, but it may have. I mean, but we don't know what the French tradition is. But still, like, you know, it's clear that this Italian political tradition is incredibly important, but it is aimed at continuity, stability, and through the building up of civil institutions. That's granted. But what I was just struck by was this kind of almost inherent willingness to slice the head off, quite literally, that comes out of this Norman yoke framework. I'll just throw that
I
one
mean,
out.
the mythical past is looming there, and this is very important. But the thing is that, and of course Machiavelli was very important. There was strong impact, there's strong influence of Machiavelli. People went to Italy, the travel, right? And this whole debate starts with Thomas Starkey, for example, right? Some of revolution, right? And how, again, the body politic, the poor, and all this stuff, right? But don't forget that Italy has a very sophisticated court culture. And this is very important. Why? And this is in response to your question about politics.
Right.
Because in order to navigate politics and to be successful, you don't need a contract. Right? You need to navigate, and you need to know the mechanism of how to operate in a court culture. That's why the Italians have the simulation, right? They have simulation, they have all these techniques that are conducive to dealing with those in power. Right? When you deal with the head of the department, for example, or a senator, you don't need the contract. You need a manual, right, about how to deal with those that possess power. That's why you don't have the same radical transformation or rupture you have in England. Because the Italians are informed by a very profound sense of there's a very profound awareness that there's a core culture and you need to employ all those techniques to survive in this very fluid, very unstable setting. And that's where fortune comes in, fate. Because there are things that happen in the world, phenomena, calamities, that you cannot ascribe to divine will. In my sense, fortune and fate is a category used by thinkers to designate phenomena, occurrences that cannot be ascribed to God. Why would God allow something to happen, right? Like Puerto Rico or whatever. And these occurrences evade human wisdom, prudence, and the ability to foresee the future. So one of the major themes that informs this tradition is fortune. And the ability of the ruler or the government to deal with fortune, with those calamities that are inescapable. It will happen. You can always foresee them, right? But but political success is the ability to deal with those phenomena.
Yeah. I'm actually struck by the importance of late antiquity. It's really too bad that our late antique historians left, but the different experiences of late antiquity and British Isles versus Northern Italy or Central Italy or wherever it may be. I mean, they maintained connections with that Mediterranean state past that informed. I mean, you talk about the decisions made in the 7th century. I think, they are emerging out of the late antique crisis. But I'll just throw that out there.
A major source has been revived in this period is Tacitus, right? Tacitus is very important. And many of these writers produce commentaries on Tacitus. And there are sections about dissimulation, how the ruler should employ dissimulation to conceal his intentions and galvanize support. So the Bible, people use biblical examples, right? But Rome is very important. And Tacitus provides a very powerful lens through which to look at politics. So, in a sense, this is a debate that's been going on since the Renaissance between the contractarian tradition, right, the contract, roles, etc., and those manuals, those books written for specific rulers and mere princes. And this genre is more about the modalities of power, about the technical aspects of how to acquire power, how to deal with the sovereign, than about the contract. And this is very important. So this is something which I think determine the orientation of political science. That's your question today. Our model of political science is predominantly based on the contract, right? That's our concept of democracy, a specific contract. But how much do we know, or do we care about the modalities of power and how to engage with those that hold power, for example? In this period, another very important work is Castiglione's Courtier, a work written not for the prince, but for courtiers. How would courtiers deal with the sovereign? So you have Machiavelli writing for the prince, but you have Castiglione writing for those that serve the prince and can influence the prince using different techniques. And the question here is, who has real power in this whole system? Because you look at the prince, you look at the Medici, and you have the impression that these are the real power holders, right? But behind the Medici, or behind every sovereign, every president or leader, there's a whole group of people being involved in this conversation, in decision making. And this is very important.
Can I just, again, picking up on John's distinctions here, between the sort of contractarian, Anglophone world and the Italian, because obviously the contractarian and the whole framework in which the likes of Hobbes and Locke are dealing with, behind all that is the sense that any state that ultimately is created is an artificial entity by definition. And I'm just wondering, in the Italian tradition, by contrast, is the città seen as a natural entity? And this relates then to the further distinction where in medieval thought, clearly whatever kind of a body we're talking about, the body politic, is seen as made up of people. It's a human superorganism, if you want a better term. Whereas what you're talking about seems to be a move away from that towards thinking of the città as being made up of, it's an assemblage of people and things, such that it's no longer necessarily a natural entity. So I'm wondering, artificiality versus naturalness, just at the level, since all we're talking about here is presuppositions behind everything, what is the presupposition behind your guys? Are they conscious of a movement towards the idea of thinking of the state as an artificial creation, or are they still in a world where, at least to a point, it's people and it's a natural thing, a natural formation, because humans can't exist except as members of superorganisms?
That's a great question. And again, they're in the middle, but I mean, those writers they all operate on the assumption of original sin, right? This is very important, and they all operate within a very strong Christian culture. So in that sense, the state is organic. The state is there because it's a remedy against sin, right? And people can't live without the state, without the human society. At the same time, there is a certain degree of artificiality, the way you present it, by incorporating resources, buildings, things, into do the city, you do the set rule. So it's not just about the citizen per se, or the citizens of a specific city. It's more about the ensemble of things, the assortment of all these things, like citizens, like buildings, like resources, that constitute this state. And in this sense, Foucault is right that this concept of the state is one of the progenitors of the modern concept of governmentality. And the emphasis of the ruler's task in terms of allocating resources, statistics, data, and organizing population is a fundamental feature of these writings about political success and revolution. That's why there's a strong emphasis on allocation of resources and also for the various parts of the city, because every citizen has a specific function and is assigned a specific segment of society. So any effort to go beyond that segment and to take over different functions and roles is a potential source of friction and political change, revolution. So I would say it's a very conservative way of thinking about revolutions, in a very that aims at the conservation of the state. Right.
So really,
but it's just very sophisticated at the same time.
And
very subtle.
And I mean, again, I'll call it a Mediterranean tradition, and I see it spreading north, and everybody to the north saying this is our means to stability. That's why they study the Italian text. That's why they study they study about the Venetian polity, because these are polities that have lasted, and everybody to the north wants that kind of stability. So this Mediterranean tradition, effectively, is, which I would argue actually has its deep roots in the Eastern Mediterranean in the Bronze Age. We're talking, why is this a natural thing? This is an ancient. This is layer upon layer upon layer over thousands of years. I mean, the Romans, fine, yes, but the Romans are like Johnny come latelys, relatively speaking, and there's a lot of stuff that's lost. So just to annoy everybody. One theoretical point that struck me, within the last 6 months, I finally learned a little bit about Bourdieu. So we'll French, Bourdieu, I would put into that, particularly on his book on the state. Is, when you come to grips with that book, it's very much about the story you're telling, about how you maintain, how you conserve, it's almost a functional analysis. And so, in effect, your Italian style, should we say, of dealing with rulers and knowing the field of politics. This is the core language of Bourdieu, and I'm just wondering whether it's useful to think about Bourdieu in this, in some way shaped by and immersed in the story that you're telling. It may not be direct, but it's what's the relationship between the story that you're telling about the Italian Mediterranean tradition and Bourdieu's approach, which is very functionalist and stability oriented on the state.
But is stability a unicorn? That's the other question. Is it the thing that they never had and never will? That they're in this sort of, they're engaged in a creative act to really just manage what is in fact an ongoing reality. I mean, this is, you propose this in your paper. I think it's sort of you propose it in the context of post-colonial states, but I think it seems to be, one could argue it is in fact interesting that so many of these texts, ancient and early modern and modern, are obsessed with these questions of stability. And even Jack Goldstone's model is, what's unstable? What are predictors of instability and therefore revolution? When, what is this what is the stability they speak of? When does it exist? Who achieves it? So, to me, I think both England and Italy are models of instability, frankly. So that here you get.
There's a much more highly developed theory of stability going on.
But yeah, exactly. And that may just be something about stability's the relative absence of stability. So the stability is in China, and these distant places, you know, that,
It's comparison.
and it's a utopian ideal in some ways, right? So I didn't know if you had thoughts about that, but I like Greg's idea about the city. So, you know, when Vasileios talked to my graduate class this morning, he was talking about other models, including Islamic models, that were looking at the city. You know, Medina means city. You know, that's a sort of a model. And to me, cities are places, even in the English tradition, they are places that have corporate rights, even vis-a-vis the ruler. They are places that ruled, even within a, you know, within princedom or a kingdom that had unique powers and getting at those sorts of kind of administrative powers and resource powers and institutions of self-government. And they also include other corporate bodies. So they're also the place where you have guilds, where you have, you know, you have not just the estates, but you have other groups that are, you know, professional organizations, more or less with special privileges, that have identities and meetings and elections and so on and so forth. So you have like these kind of really complicated and interesting array of organizations and organizational life that might also be part of why the discussion is so robust in that moment of their, you know, global capitalism and their global involvement, the money flowing in, the global, the heightened degree of global contacts, the imperial project. You know, there's so much going on in that period. So.
And then there's the scientific revolution going on as well,
Right.
which encompasses universes are totally secular ones.
Right.
But, you know, they're taking the city into a, you know, into what's perhaps in a different, you know, very different kind of material, commercial, and global era, but they're still bringing some of those institutions with it. I don't know. I just don't know if that would serve useful, something useful for you.
It's as fascinating as I find this discussion. I want to try to turn things in a somewhat broader direction. Ming and Qing China also had a reason of state that emphasized this Confucian culture of ours. And they talked in these terms across dynastic change, revolutionary or not. However, a central preoccupation among the Chinese was dynastic loyalty or disloyalty. And so I wonder whether this pair of values plays any role in Italian reason of state. You anticipated this question a little bit, I think, when you were talking about dissimulation before, how to survive in a political state. But the Chinese really theorized this issue of loyalty and disloyalty across dynastic divides. And it's partly because, in certain ways, the Chinese share the value system that I recall Aristotle talking about in the Politics. I'm drawing on memories from 40 years ago. But what I recall is that Aristotle talks about the polis, or the state, as a place where one's full humanity can be achieved. And I think the Chinese have, in the pre-20th century period, the Chinese have a very similar outlook on state service.
Actually, I wrote a paper on the translation of a Korean classic about ministers. And I wrote something, I can send you a draft of it, about reform in Italy and the Chinese world in the 50th, 60th century. So you have all these manuals written for ministers or even diplomats, ambassadors, how they should deal with things. And I think you're right. Beyond the stuff you mentioned, I think China has a very similar genre of writing about politics that emphasizes mirrors of princes and also loyalty to dynasty. Because this is more of a dynastic state, right? Mm-hmm. It's not a state as envisioned by Buddha, right?
Right.
It all revolves around a specific dynasty, right? And I was telling John, I met Fukuyama last year at Stanford. We looked about his Ming Dynasty and the order, the new book, right, about the origins of order. And the Ming Dynasty, in a way, prefigures and evolves certain structures that are very similar to those in Europe. The problem here is that, unlike Islam or the Chinese tradition, we don't have dynastic states. So you don't have the same degree of loyalty you have in China or in Islam to a specific dynasty in Italian writing. Because even in Islam, the entire debate about oath and about a so-called contract between the ruler, the sovereign, and the people is involved in a specific dynasty. And once the dynasty is gone, there will be a new cycle, a new chapter, a new state. And this is one of the major problems when you try to compare these traditions with Italy, that you don't have a dynasty. You have a specific ruler, but the loyalty to the ruler doesn't translate into loyalty to a specific dynasty. And again, that's a very different model because, and I mean, Ibn Khaldun, for example, talks about dynasties, right? There's a cycle of dynasties, right? And once the dynasty is gone, there'll be a new dynasty over and creating a new state. So you have this cycle of dynasties, right? This cycle of regimes that is very Polybian, but it revolves around dynasties. In Italy, you don't have the same degree of preoccupation with dynasties. You have more debates are about the ruler or about specific aims, policies, but not about the dynasty. That's why you don't have, I believe, this emphasis on loyalty you have in China. But at the same time, you have a very strong, very vigorous tradition of writing about the modalities of power. I mean, Han Fei Zhu is a very good example, right? And the section about ministers is very similar to Castellano. So you have very strong interest in how you deal with power and how you try to get involved in this very complex process of decision making in a very fluid setting.
Just to clarify, although there is the issue of the dynastic cycle,
Right.
this fixed phrase, this culture of ours, reflects a mentality that this culture precedes the dynasty. And we as officials, although we must be loyal to the Son of Heaven, we also have an obligation to educate the Son of Heaven in this culture of ours. So
I think the culture, I'm not an expert on China, but my impression is that this phrase, this concept refers to a pre-existing political, social culture, and the new ruler or reformer needs to be initiated, galvanized to support, to build on this culture and sustain the state. And in that sense, the major duty of the members of society, or ministers or officials, is to assist the ruler and initiate him into this pre-existing culture.
yeah.
But I don't think it's about political structures per se. It's about the political culture that is there. It's in the air, it's in the city, it's in the country, it's in the empire. But I don't think it designates a specific state.
Well, in the last two dynasties, it is a particular state.
Right.
It's an administrative state
Right.
that Ming officials created and that Qing officials inherit.
So that's the key, though. This is our culture. You mentions are outsiders, so we have to educate you into the structures and culture of our society. Now, there's actually a parallel in Italy, which is I'm the city of X and the city of Y and the city of Z. We have our local institutions, and we either get bought or we invite a ruler to come and join us. The same deal would apply, that the ruler coming in from the outside of an Italian city-state, hypothetically, based on Bartaccio, we had somebody here who told me a lot about city-states and the trading of city-states, that there was a lot of continuity internally, and there were rulers being exchanged all over the place, and it's not completely dissimilar from this barbarian Manchu coming in and being educated into the.
I totally agree, and this is why Western imperialism, which is a kind of revolution broadly understood in the Qing period, is so traumatic, because those Westerners will not learn the system. From the 1790s onwards, the British, with their contract-based understanding of social relations, will not learn the system. And they introduce discontinuity to it. Everybody else, the Russians, the Portuguese, the Dutch, they'll all learn the system, but the British won't.
The Italians, the Jesuits?
Yeah, the Jesuits too, yeah. Not all Italian, by the way.
Well, our time is up, although Vasileios has agreed to sort of stay on and talk more formally with anyone who wants to stay and to chat a little bit more about his more specific research. So let's thank him for representing